Before I tell you what happened out in the bottoms, I need to make one thing clear. I don't blame the woods for being dangerous. The Delta is ancient, and things out here grow bigger, meaner, and older than folks in the city understand. But what we found last October wasn't nature. It was a mistake of nature. My name is Jude, and I'm 19. I've spent my entire life working the timber and swampland my family owns in Mississippi. I've tracked hogs, wrestled gators, and spent nights in blinds so dark you can't see your own hand. I thought I knew every noise these woods could make. But what my sister and I ran from wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a man. The only word that fits is alpha. I don't expect anyone to believe the monster part, but to understand why we were out there and why we almost didn't make it back, you have to understand how my family works. On our property, there have always been two kinds of kids, the one allowed to be wild and the one expected to clean up the mess. I didn't realize how deep that cut went until I saw how my father treated my sister, Judith. Judith has always been the firecracker. She's loud, reckless, and has that easy boyish grin that makes adults forgive her for things they'd whip anyone else for. Dad calls her spirited. He looks at her recklessness and sees courage. Then there's me. I'm the workhorse, lean, wiry, and tired. If Judith broke a window, I should have been watching her. If she skipped chores, I should have covered for her. I learned early on that being the older brother didn't mean I was in charge. It just meant I was the insurance policy. That was the backdrop for the scouting trip. It was right before deer season, the air was thick enough to chew on, and Dad decided Judith was finally ready to bag her first big buck. He didn't ask if I wanted to go. He just dropped a heavy pack of gear at my feet and handed Judith the good rifle. He looked at me with that stone-heavy stare of his, the kind that assumes authority without question, and gave me the same order he's given me since I was 6 years old. Jude, take her to the deep blind, and don't let anything happen to her. He didn't know he was sending us into a kill zone, and I didn't know that my sister's need to prove herself was about to wake up something that had been sleeping in the mud for a very, very long time. The morning of the hunt didn't start with a sunrise. It started with the smell of burnt coffee and the metallic tang of gun oil. It was 4 in the morning, the kind of dark that feels heavy against the windows, and the kitchen was already buzzing with an energy that set my teeth on edge. Judith was sitting at the scarred oak table, her boots up on the chair opposite her, wiping down the barrel of her .270. She wasn't doing it right. She was moving too fast, chatting a mile a minute, her hands jittery with caffeine and adrenaline. She looked like a kid on Christmas morning, eyes bright, that reckless grin plastered across her face. "I'm telling you, Jude, I can feel it," she said, snapping the boat back with a loud clack that made me wince. "Today's the day. I'm going to drop a monster, a 10-pointer at least, maybe 12. I stood at the counter, methodically packing the first aid kit. I checked the tourniquet, the gauze, the antiseptic, then I moved to the water bottles, checking the seals. "You keep snapping that boat, you're going to wear the spring," I said, my voice low, "and keep the muzzle down. You swept the fridge twice." Judith rolled her eyes, a dramatic, theatrical gesture she'd perfected by age 10. "Relax, Grandma. It's not loaded. You worry so much you're going to turn gray before you're 20. Before I could answer, the screen door slammed and Dad walked in. He brought the humidity with him, a wall of damp, earthy air that clung to his flannel shirt. He looked at me, then at the pile of gear I was organizing, the compass, the maps, the emergency flare, and his brow just furrowed slightly, like he was looking at a tax audit. Then he looked at Judith and his face transformed. The stern lines around his mouth softened, and a warmth entered his eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "That's the spirit," Dad said, walking over and clapping a heavy hand on Judith's shoulder. "I could hear you talking from the truck. You ready to show the boys how it's done?" "Born ready, Daddy," Judith beamed, leaning into his praise like a cat in a sunbeam. "Jude's just being a fuss budget again, thinking I'm going to shoot the toaster." Dad chuckled, a deep rumble of a sound. "Jude's always thinking about what could go wrong. That's his nature. But you," he squeezed her shoulder, shaking her slightly, "you've got the fire, girl. You've got the instinct. That's what puts meat in the freezer. Hesitation leaves you hungry." I tightened the cap on the canteen, my knuckles white. "It's not hesitation," I said, staring at the water. "It's discipline.
We're going 3 miles into the bottoms. The mud's waist deep in the draws, and the forecast says fog. If we get turned around out there, if, Dad interrupted, his voice hardening instantly as he turned to me. You're 19 years old, Jude. You know these woods better than the back of your hand. If you get turned around, that's on you, not the fog. He walked over to the gun cabinet and pulled out a box of high-grade ammunition, Hornaday rounds, the expensive stuff. He tossed the box to Judith. She caught it one-handed, grinning. I want you two at the high point blind, Dad commanded, pouring himself a cup of the sludge that passed for coffee. I froze. High Point, Dad. I turned to face him. The trail to High Point is washed out. The creek is swollen from the storms last week. It'll take us 2 hours just to hike in, and we'll be wading through the marsh for half of it. The deer are moving to high ground because of the water, Dad said, taking a sip and grimacing. That's where the big bucks are bedding down. High Point is the spot. It's dangerous, I pressed, turning to face him. The ground is unstable. If one of us slips a knee or breaks an ankle, it's a 4-mile drag out. Why don't we stick to the ridgeline? It's safer, and Judith can still get a clear shot. Dad slammed his mug down. It wasn't a violent slam, just hard enough to silence the room. I didn't ask for a safety briefing, Jude. I told you where to go. Your sister wants a trophy, and I'm telling you where to find it. Are you saying you can't handle a little mud? He looked at me with that familiar mix of disappointment and challenge. It was a trap, and we both knew it. If I refused, I was a coward. If I agreed, I was responsible for whatever happened. Judith chimed in, emboldened by his support. Yeah, Jude, don't be such a wimp. I can hike it if you can't. I looked at her, soft hands, clean boots, eyes full of unearned confidence. Then I looked at Dad, who was already turning away, dismissing me. Fine, I said, the word tasting like ash. High Point. Good, Dad said, not looking back. Take the heavy pack. Carry the water and the blind repair kit. I don't want your sister tired out before she gets her shot. You're the mule today, son. Let her be the hunter. 10 minutes later, we were at the truck. I was loading the heavy gear into the bed, checking the straps, double-checking the spare tire. Dad stood on the porch, watching us. He wasn't watching me work. He was watching Judith shoulder her rifle, posing like she was on the cover of a magazine. He gave her a thumbs up. She laughed, a bright, sharp sound that cut through the pre-dawn silence. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the wheel, staring out at the dark tree line of the Mississippi timber. I felt a heavy, cold stone settle in my gut. It wasn't just anger. It was a premonition. The woods treated like a playground, a stage for their egos. But the woods didn't care who was the favorite. The woods only cared about who was paying attention. Let's go, Slowpoke, Judith yelled, slapping the dashboard. I started the engine, leaving the safety of the driveway behind, driving my sister towards the one place I knew we shouldn't go. We parked the truck at the end of the gravel levee, where the solid road surrendered to the encroaching soup of the Mississippi bottoms. The moment I cut the engine, the silence didn't settle in. The heat did. It was barely dawn, but the air was already thick enough to drink, a heavy, wet blanket smelling of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and wet earth. All right, I whispered, stepping out and easing my door shut with a soft click. Wham! Judith slammed the passenger door with the force of a gavel, the sound cracking through the stillness like a gunshot. A flock of blackbirds erupted from a nearby cypress, cawing in alarm. I flinched, closing my eyes for a second, feeling the headache I'd woken up with tighten behind my temples. Oops, Judith said, not looking sorry in the least. She was already slathering on bug spray, the aerosol hiss sounding like a jet engine in the quiet morning. Door sticks, you should fix that.
I didn't argue. I just walked to the bed of the truck and hauled out the rucksack. It was overloaded with the blind repair kit, the extra water, the emergency supplies, and the heavy spotlight Dad insisted we bring. I shrugged it on, the straps digging instantly into shoulders that were already tense. Judith grabbed her rifle, slinging it over her shoulder by the strap like a purse, the barrel waving carelessly toward the tree line. "Lead the way, Scout," she said, popping a piece of gum into her mouth. We dropped down off the levee and into the timber. Immediately, the world changed. The canopy overhead was a tangled net of oak and cypress, draped in Spanish moss that hung motionless in the dead air. The ground wasn't solid. It was the infamous Delta gumbo mud, black, sticky, and hungry. It grabbed at your boots with every step,
making a sucking sound as you fought to lift your foot for the next stride. I moved with the rhythm I'd learned before I could read, stepping heel to toe, rolling my weight to avoid snapping twigs, keeping my eyes scanning 180 degrees. I watched the wind direction, though there wasn't much, and kept my profile low. Behind me, Judith moved like a bulldozer. Snap, squelch, splash. She stepped on every dry branch I avoided. She kicked at palmetto fronds instead of weaving through them. Every 30 seconds, she swatted at a mosquito with a loud thwack against her neck. "God, it is disgusting out here," she complained, her voice at a conversational volume that made my skin crawl. "Why couldn't we just hunt the bean field? Dad has a heated stand there." I stopped, turning slowly to face her. I kept my voice to a harsh whisper. "Because Dad sent us here. And if you want to see anything other than a squirrel, you need to stop talking. You're sounding like a marching band." She rolled her eyes, shifting her weight and almost losing her balance in the muck. "You take this way too seriously, Jude. Deer are dumb. They don't care about a little noise." "They aren't dumb," I hissed. "They're prey animals. Everything wants to kill them, so they hear everything. And out here, in the deep bottoms, the things that live here are old and smart. You disrespect the woods, and you come home empty-handed." "Whatever," she muttered, pushing past me. "Just hurry up. My boots are leaking." I let her take the lead for a moment, mostly so I could keep an eye on where her rifle barrel was pointing. Watching her stumble through the briars was painful. She fought the woods, pushing branches away violently instead of sliding through them, cursing every time a thorn snagged her expensive jacket. She was an intruder here, loud and foreign, completely out of sync with the rhythm of the wild. As we pushed deeper, the terrain grew harsher. The ground turned into a maze of cypress knees and black water pools. The heat rose with the sun, turning the swamp into a sauna. Sweat ran down my back, soaking my shirt under the heavy pack. My legs burned from the effort of pulling my boots out of the mud, but I kept my breathing steady, measured. But it wasn't the heat or Judith's noise that started to bother me. It was the feeling. About a mile in, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't something you could see, but something you felt in the lizard part of your brain. The woods felt crowded. Usually the swamp is a noisy place, frogs, crickets, cicadas, the splash of turtles. But the deeper we went, the more the background noise seemed to thin out. It didn't go silent, not yet, but the rhythm was off. The birds were higher in the canopy than usual. The squirrels weren't barking. I found myself pausing more often, scanning the dense wall of palmettos to our left. I felt eyes on us, not the passive observation of a deer watching from a thicket, but a heavy, predatory focus. It felt like walking past a fence with a guard dog on the other side, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being tracked. "Jude, come on," Judith called out from 20 yards ahead, her rifle propped dangerously against a rotting log. I caught up to her, grabbing the rifle and shoving it back into her hands. "Don't ever set your weapon down in the mud," I snapped, my patience fraying. "I'm tired," she whined, wiping sweat from her forehead, smearing dirt across her cheek. "Are we there yet? This is stupid. Dad said it was a good trail." "Dad hasn't been back here in 10 years, I said, looking past her into the shadows of the cypress grove. The feeling of being watched intensified, making the hair on my arm stand up despite the heat. "Keep moving. We need to get to the stand. We're too exposed out here." "Exposed to what?" she laughed, a sharp, jarring sound. "Mosquitoes?" I didn't answer. I just pushed her forward, my grip on my own rifle tightening. I couldn't explain it to her. She wouldn't listen anyway. But the woods felt wrong, heavy, expectant, like the swamp was holding its breath, waiting for us to make one final mistake. We smelled it before we saw it. The scent hit us like a physical slap, a thick, hot wall of copper and voided boughs that cut right through the swamp's usual odor of rotting vegetation. It was the smell of something violently unmade. "Ugh, God," Judith gagged, covering her nose and mouth with her sleeve. I held up a hand, signaling for a stop, but she bumped into me behind anyway, too busy looking at her boots to watch the trail. I ignored her and scanned the wind. It was dead still, meaning the source was close, very close. "We stay here," I whispered, unslinging my rifle. The uneasy feeling of being watched had hardened into a cold knot in my stomach. "Don't be dramatic," she muttered, though her voice wavered slightly. "It's probably just a hog that got stuck in the mud." I moved forward, pushing through a dense curtain of briars into a small, muddy clearing where the canopy broke enough to let shafts of harsh sunlight stab down to the earth. It wasn't a hog.
Lying in the center of the muck was a white-tailed buck. A big one, 10 points at least, the kind of mature, heavy-bodied deer that usually ghosted through the woods unseen. But it hadn't just died, it had been obliterated. The carcass was twisted in a way that defied anatomy. The spine snapped with enough force to fold the animal nearly in half. But it was the chest cavity that made my breath hitch. It had been torn open. Not bitten, not chewed, torn. The ribs were splayed outward like the wings of a grotesque bird, cracked clean from the sternum. "Whoa," Judith said, stepping up beside me. She lowered her hand from her face, morbid curiosity overriding her disgust. "Big boy. Shame the coyotes got to him before we did." I crouched down, the mud seeping instantly into the knees of my pants. I ignored the swarm of green bottle flies buzzing in a frantic cloud around the mess. "This wasn't coyotes," I said quietly. "Coyotes nip. They drag. They eat from the rear up. Look at this." I pointed to the shoulder. The hide had been shredded, leaving deep, parallel furrows in the muscle underneath. "Bear, then," Judith shrugged, shifting her weight impatiently. "A black bear woke up hungry. Big deal. We have bear tags." I shook my head, my eyes tracing the wounds. "Bears have 5 claws, Jude, but the spacing, look at the spacing." I hovered my hand over the gashes without touching the raw meat. The gouges were too wide, too deep. A bear rakes its claws across prey, leaving a messy, tearing wound. These marks looked surgical in their violence. It looked like something had gripped the deer, actually gripped it, and pulled the muscle away from the bone with pure mechanical torque. And there was something else, something worse. "It didn't eat," I whispered. "What?" "Look at the meat," I said, my voice tight. "The hams are untouched, the backstraps are still there, the organs are spilled out, but nothing's been consumed. No bite marks on the bones, no chewing. Predators don't kill for fun, not out here. A bear kills to eat, a cougar kills to eat. Even a pack of wild dogs will strip a carcass to the bone in an hour. But this book had been snapped like a twig and discarded. It wasn't a meal, it was a statement, or a toy that had broken too easily." "Maybe we spooked it," Judith suggested, though she was looking around the clearing now, her grip on her rifle tightening. "This kill is hours old," I said, touching a patch of blood that had already started to tacky and blacken in the heat. "Whatever did this is long gone, or it's watching to see what we do with its trash." I stood up, wiping my hand on my pants, trying to scrub away the feeling of the air. It felt heavier here, surcharged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. The silence I'd noticed earlier was absolute now. No birds, no frogs. Even the flies seemed to be the only things daring to make a sound. My eyes fell on the mud near the buck's head. The ground was churned up, a mess of hoofprints sliding in panic. But right in the middle of the struggle, there was a depression in the gumbo. It was deep, inches deeper than our own boot prints. It was a print, but it was wrong. It had the general shape of a canine pad, but it was elongated, stretched out, and at the front, where the claws should have been merely ticked into the mud, there were deep gouges, as if the toes had dug in to pivot. I placed my own boot next to it. The print dwarfed my size 12. "Jude, let's go," Judith said, her voice finally losing her bravado. "It smells, and you're freaking me out. If it's a rogue bear, I don't want to be standing over its lunch." "It's not a bear,"
I said, but I didn't tell her what I thought it was because my brain refused to form the word. I looked at the snapped spine of the buck again. The sheer power required to do that to a 200-pound animal was terrifying. I stood up slowly, backing away from the carcass. The woods felt suddenly very small and very crowded. "You're right," I lied, forcing my voice to stay steady for her sake. "Let's move, but we're not going to the blind. We're circling back to the levee." "What? No!" Judith snapped, her fear instantly replaced by indignation. "We are not quitting because of some dead deer. Dad will kill us if we come back early." "Judith, look at that thing." I pointed at the carcass, my temper flaring. "That is not a hunting trophy. That is a warning. Something massive is in this block of woods, and we are carrying 270s, not howitzers." "I'm not going back," she said, turning and marching toward the far side of the clearing, deeper into the swamp. "If it's a predator, I'll shoot it. That's why we have guns, Jude. Stop being a coward." She stepped over a pile of entrails and shoved through the brush. I stood there for a second, paralyzed by the sight of the brutalized deer and the retreating back of my sister. The dread that had been a cold knot was now ice water in my veins. She didn't understand. She saw a target. I saw a crime scene. "Judith, wait!" I hissed, sprinting to catch up to her, leaving the broken buck to the flies. I knew, with absolute certainty, that we had just crossed a line we shouldn't have. We weren't the hunters anymore.
We trudged on for another 40 minutes, the mud sucking at our shins with a gluttonous, wet sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. By the time the trees finally thinned out, opening up into the clearing Dad called High Point, my shirt was plastered to my back like a second skin, and the straps of the rucksack had rubbed raw lines into my shoulders. High Point wasn't much of a hill, just a knoll of land rising a few feet out of the soup, crowned by a massive ancient oak tree that looked like it had been dying since the Civil War. Wedged into the fork of its lower branches was the blind, a plywood box that had weathered to a skeletal gray, half swallowed by creeping vines and hanging moss. "Finally," Judith groaned, dropping her rifle butt first into the dirt, a cardinal sin I didn't have the energy to correct. She doubled over, hands on her knees, sucking in the humid air. "I thought this place was supposed to be a hunter's paradise. It looks like a shack." I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning the perimeter. The unease that had started at the kill site hadn't faded. It had curdled into a tight, vibrating tension in my chest. I walked a slow circle around the base of the oak, checking the ground. The mud here was firmer, but the feeling of exposure was worse. We were miles from the levee, cut off by a labyrinth of water and thorns, standing on a tiny island in a sea of hostile wilderness. "Help me up," Judith commanded, looking up at the rusted ladder nailed to the trunk. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand. "Let me check the structure first. That wood looks rot soft." I climbed up first, testing every rung. The wood groaned under my weight, dry and brittle, but it held. Inside, the blind was a cramped, dusty oven, smelling of rat droppings and old mildew. I cleared out a nest of spiders and signaled for her to follow. Once we were both squeezed into the box, staring out through the narrow shooting slits, the waiting game began. This was usually the part of hunting I loved, the meditative stillness, the way the woods slowly forgot you were there and came back to life. But the woods didn't come back to life. For the first 20 minutes, the usual chorus of the Delta was there, albeit subdued. The buzzing of cicadas, the distant splash of gar rolling in the black water, the irritating whine of mosquitoes. Judith fidgeted constantly, checking her phone, no signal, sighing and tapping her fingernails against the wooden ledge. "This is boring," Judith whispered, loudly. "Nothing's moving." "Hunting is waiting," I murmured, eyes scanning the tree line. "Just sit still." Then it happened. It wasn't a sudden silence like a door slamming shut. It was a ripple effect, a wave of suppression rolling towards us from the deep north. The cicadas in the distance cut out first,
A section of the choir suddenly silenced. Then the tree frogs ceased their chirping. The silence moved closer, consuming the radius of sound around us, until even the mosquitoes buzzing near our ears seemed to vanish. In less than a minute, the swamp went dead. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty room. It was the terrified silence of a holding cell. The air, already heavy with humidity, seemed to thicken, pressing against my eardrums. The atmospheric pressure felt like it dropped 10 points in seconds, the way it does right before a tornado touches down. "Weird," Judith whispered, and for the first time she didn't sound annoyed. She sounded small. "Where did the bugs go?" I didn't answer. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt too loud in the unnatural vacuum. Nature doesn't just stop. In the Mississippi bottoms, life is a constant, noisy struggle. The only thing that commands this kind of total reverence is an apex predator, something so dominant that even the insects are afraid to reveal their position. "Jude," Judith nudged me, her voice trembling. "Why is it so quiet?" "Shh," I hissed, barely breathing. "Don't move." Then the wind shifted. A faint breeze drifted in through the shooting slit, carrying the message we had been dreading. It hit the back of my throat before my nose registered it, a taste of copper and filth. The smell was a magnified, concentrated version of what we'd found at the deer carcass. It was the musk of a wet, dirty animal, pungent and sour, mixed with the sweet, cloying scent of old rot. But there was something else underneath it, something sharp and acrid, like ozone or sulfur. It smelled like aggression. Judith recoiled, covering her nose with her hand. "Oh my God," she gagged, her eyes watering. "Is that the dead deer? Did the wind carry it here?" I shook my head slowly, my eyes locked on the dense wall of palmettos 100 yards out. "No," I whispered, the ice over my blood. "The deer was miles back, and the wind is coming from the north. This wasn't a dead thing rotting in the sun. This was fresh. This was close." The smell grew stronger, rolling over us in invisible waves, filling the tiny box until I felt like I was choking on it. It was the scent of something that had rolled in death and risen up to hunt again. Out in the timber, a single dry branch snapped. It wasn't the light crack of a squirrel or the heavy crash of a clumsy deer. It was a deliberate, heavy snap, the sound of something massive placing its weight down without caring who heard it. "Jude," Judith whimpered, shrinking back against the rotten plywood wall, her bravado finally stripped away completely. "What is that?" I raised my rifle, settling the stock against my shoulder, and peered through the scope into the shadows. "I don't know," I lied, "but it knows we're here."
I pressed my eye against the rubber ring of the scope, my hand slick with sweat on the rifle stock. Through the magnified glass, the world was a shaky circle of green and brown blur. I held my breath, forcing my heart rate to drop, forcing the crosshairs to settle on the gap between two massive cypress trunks where the branch had snapped.
"Do you see it?"
Judith breathed, the sound barely audible over the pounding of my own blood in my ears.
"Quiet,"
I mouthed, not taking my eye off the trees. For a moment there was nothing but the oppressive stillness and the heat shimmering off the mud. Then the shadows between the trees seemed to liquefy. It didn't step out like a deer, timid and checking the wind, and it didn't lumber out like a bear, heavy and low. It emerged with a terrifying, fluid surrealism, as if the darkness itself was coalescing into a solid form. First came the shoulder, a massive sloped mound of dark muscle that pushed a 3-inch sapling aside as if it were a blade of grass. Then the head followed, and my brain stuttered, refusing to process the geometry of what I was seeing. Through the scope, I saw a muzzle, long, tapered, and unmistakably canine, with heavy, wet jowls that hung slightly open, revealing the flash of yellowed ivory.
Short, triangular ears twitched independently, swiveling like radar dishes. It was the head of a wolf, but it was scaled up to a size that made no biological sense. It was broad enough to crush a man's skull in a single bite. But it was when the creature fully stepped into the shaft of sunlight bathing the clearing that the true horror set in. It was walking on 2 legs. I lowered the rifle, needing to see it with my own eyes to believe it. The creature stood easily 7 feet tall, perhaps closer to 8, towering over the palmettos that would have hidden a grown Nan. A black bear standing on its hind legs looks awkward, a temporary balancing act of a quadruped trying to be tall. This thing stood upright with a natural, horrifying stability. It was a biological nightmare, a creature that looked wrongly assembled from parts that didn't belong together. The torso was V-shaped, tapering from those massive, hunched shoulders down to a narrow, ropey waist. Its chest was a slab of dense muscle covered in coarse, dark fur that was matted with dried mud and what looked like old blood. But the fur wasn't uniform. There were patches of gray, scaly skin visible where the hair had been rubbed away or scarred over, thick, jagged lines of white tissue that mapped a history of violence. Its arms were the worst part. They were too long, dangling well past its knees, ending in hands that were a grotesque hybrid of paw and human palm. I could see the articulation of fingers, long, dark digits tipped with curved black talons the length of butcher knives. They twitched at its sides, opening and closing in a spasm of latent energy. "Jude!" Judith's voice was a high, thin whine, like a kettle about to boil. That's not a bear." "Don't move," I whispered, my voice paralyzed in my throat. "For the love of God, don't move." The creature took another step, its gait rolling and predatory. Its legs were digigrade, dog legs, with the hock joint high up and the weight balanced on the balls of its massive feet. Every time it planted a foot, I could feel the vibration travel up the trunk of the oak tree we were hiding in. It made the black bears I'd seen look like stray dogs. A bear is round, heavy, built for foraging and sleeping. This thing was built for one purpose: trauma. It was lean in a way that spoke of speed, coiled with the kind of fast-twitch muscle fiber that allows a predator to close the gap before the prey can even flinch. It stopped in the center of the clearing, right where the sunlight was hottest. It threw its head back and inhaled deeply, its ribcage expanding like a bellows. I saw the nostrils flare, tasting the air we were pouring out. The sunlight caught the side of its face, revealing a milky cloudiness in one of its amber eyes, a scar that ran from the brow down to the jaw. A Mississippi Alpha, an old king. This wasn't just a monster, it was a survivor, a veteran of the deep woods that had likely killed things bigger and meaner than us for decades. It stood there, a statue of ancient malice, looking like something dredged up from a time when humans weren't at the top of the food chain. It felt wrong to even look at it, as if my eyes were violating some primal law of nature. Judith began to shake. It wasn't a subtle tremble. It was a violent, full-body shudder that rattled the loose boards of the blind. "Make it go away," she sobbed softly, the reality of the creature shattering her arrogance into dust. "Please, Jude, make it go away." I reached out slowly, placing my hand on her shoulder to steady her, but my eyes never left the creature. It hadn't looked up yet. It was still sorting through the scents, its head swaying in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It knew we were close. It just hadn't looked up to realize that the prey wasn't on the ground. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, not just because of its size, but because of its posture. It stood with an arrogant confidence, a calm certainty that nothing in these woods could challenge it. And looking at the muscle coiled beneath that scarred hide, I knew it was right.
We were invisible. That was the only thought anchoring me to sanity. We were 10 feet up, encased in plywood and shadow, downwind of a monster that was currently studying the ground with the intensity of a forensic scientist. If we didn't move, if we didn't breathe, if we didn't exist for just a few more minutes, it might move on. It might mistake our scent for a lingering trace of yesterday. But Judith wasn't thinking about invisibility. She was thinking about survival, in the frantic, broken way a drowning person climbs on top of their rescuer. Beside me, the shaking had become a vibration that rattled the bench seat. I slowly turned my head, agonizingly slow, to signal her to stop. What I saw made my blood run cold. Judith wasn't looking at me. She was staring down through the slit, her eyes wide and glassy, completely detached from reality. Her lips were moving in a silent, frantic prayer, or maybe a curse. Then she reached for her rifle. It wasn't the smooth, practiced motion of the girl who had bragged in the kitchen this morning. It was jerky and clumsy, her hands spasming with adrenaline. The barrel clattered softly against the wooden window frame. Click. The sound was microscopic, the plastic stock bumping the wood, but in the dead silence of the swamp, it sounded like a gavel striking a desk. Below us, the creature froze. The massive, scarred head stopped its swaying. The ears swiveled backward, locking onto the oak tree. "Don't!" I mouthed, reaching out with a trembling hand to cover hers. I tried to pour every ounce of my will into that touch, begging her to freeze, to let the moment pass. She jerked away from me as if I'd burned her. Panic had stripped away her arrogance, leaving only a raw, animalistic need to destroy the thing that frightened her. She didn't look at me. She looked through the scope, her finger fumbling for the safety. "I have to," she whispered, the words spilling out in a jagged breath. "It's gonna kill us. It knows. I have to kill it." "Judith, no!" I hissed, lunging forward to grab the barrel. "It's too big. You'll just—" She shoved me back with surprising strength, her elbow catching me in the ribs. I fell back against the rear wall of the blind, the breath knocked out of me. In the half-second it took me to recover, she jammed the stock against her shoulder, not even checking her cheek weld, not breathing, just reacting. She didn't aim. She just pointed the weapon at the nightmare in the clearing and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The sound of a .270 going off inside a 4x4 wooden box was deafening. It felt like a physical blow to the head, a concussive slap that instantly set my ears ringing with a high-pitched scream. Smoke filled the tiny space, stinging my eyes. I scrambled up, blinking through the haze, desperate to see the result. Part of me, the foolishly hopeful part, prayed to see the monster lying dead in the mud. But there was no body. The bullet, fired by shaking hands and eyes squeezed shut in terror, had gone wide. I saw the fresh gouge in the earth, a splash of black mud exploding 3 feet to the left of the creature's massive leg. For a heartbeat, time suspended. In any normal world, a gunshot is the end of the encounter. A bear, a cougar, even a man, they run. The sheer volume of the explosion triggers a flight response that overrides hunger or aggression. We expected it to bolt. We needed it to bolt. It didn't bolt. The creature flinched, a ripple of muscle shuddering down its back, but it didn't take a single step backward. Instead, it slowly, deliberately turned its body to face the tree. It wasn't confused. It wasn't scared. It was insulted. The massive head tilted up, the milky, scarred eye and the good amber one locked onto the shooting slit of the blind with a precision that felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. It saw us. It looked past the wood, past the camouflage, and stared directly into my soul. Then it opened its mouth. I expected a howl, wolves howl to communicate, to gather the pack.
This wasn't a howl. The sound that erupted from its chest was a roar, a deep, guttural thunder that vibrated the floorboards under my boots. It sounded like a lion screaming into a metal culvert, layered with a grinding, mechanical rasp that set my teeth on edge. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. Judith screamed back, a thin, pathetic sound of pure terror. She racked the bolt, trying to chamber another round, but her hands were useless. The shell casing jammed in the ejection port, sticking sideways. She clawed at it, sobbing now, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "Fix it! Jude, fix it!" she shrieked, shoving the jammed rifle into my chest. I looked from the useless gun to the creature below. It dropped to all fours, its shoulders bunching up. It wasn't posturing anymore. It was coiling. "We have to go," I said, the words sounding distant in my ringing ears. "Right now." The creature launched itself forward. It didn't climb the tree. It hit the trunk with the force of a car crash. The entire blind lurched violently, wood groaning and snapping as the impact shook the ancient oak to its roots. I was thrown against the wall, Judith collapsing into a heap of sobbing flannel. We had poked the devil, and now he was coming up the ladder.
The wooden floor beneath us splintered with a sound like a gunshot, wood chips spraying upward as massive dark claws punched through the plywood from below. The entire blind lurched violently to the right, the ancient nails screeching in protest as the structure threatened to detach completely from the oak. "It's coming up!" Judith screamed, scrambling backward into the corner, kicking uselessly at the floorboards where the claws were retracting for another strike. "Get up!" I roared, grabbing the strap of her vest and hauling her to her feet. The rifle was dead weight, jammed and empty, but I didn't let her drop it. "The ladder is gone. We have to jump." "I can't," she sobbed, her eyes locked on the jagged hole in the floor where the creature's breath, hot and smelling of old blood, was venting up into the box. "It's too high." "Jump or die, Judith." I didn't wait for her consent. I shoved her toward the open window slit on the far side, away from the ladder. The creature roared again, a sound that vibrated through the soles of my boots, and the blind tilted precariously as the beast put its full weight on the support beams. I grabbed her belt and threw us both out into the humid air. We fell 10 feet, crashing through a screen of vines and moss before slamming into the swamp below. The mud saved us from broken bones, but it swallowed us to the knees instantly. The impact knocked the wind out of me, filling my mouth with the taste of brackish water and rot. I scrambled up, spitting mud, adrenaline overriding the bruising ache in my ribs. Above us, the blind was being dismantled. The creature was tearing the plywood apart like wet cardboard, its massive arms thrashing in a frenzy of destruction, looking for the prey that had just vanished. "Run!" I gasped, grabbing Judith's arm. She was on her hands and knees in the muck, staring up at the blind, paralyzed by the sight of the monster ripping through the roof of our hiding spot. She was catatonic, her face a mask of white shock beneath the grime. "Judith!" I screamed, yanking her arm hard enough to pop the shoulder joint. She didn't move. She was dead weight, anchored by terror. The creature stopped tearing at the blind. It heard us. The massive head snapped down, looking over the edge of the ruined platform. The milky eye found us instantly. It didn't roar this time. It just dropped. It landed with a heavy, wet thud 10 yards away, splashing black water waist-high. "Move!" I let go of her arm and grabbed her collar, physically dragging her backward through the sludge. The sudden violence of my grip seemed to jumpstart her brain. She shrieked, a raw animal sound, and scrambled to her feet. We turned and ran, plunging into the labyrinth of cypress knees and briars. This wasn't the careful, measured trekking of the morning. This was a blind, frantic tear through terrain that wanted to kill us. The mud sucked at our boots, trying to hold us in place for the predator behind us. Vines whipped across my face, tearing skin. Thorns shredded my clothes. I didn't feel any of it.
All I felt was the terrifying vibration of the ground behind us. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming. It wasn't running, it was galloping. We could hear the brush snapping like gunfire as it bulldozed through the vegetation we were struggling to push aside. It was faster than us, much faster. The only thing saving us was the density of the timber. It had to smash through the obstacles we could duck under. "Faster!" I yelled, pushing Judith ahead of me as we navigated a cluster of palmettos. She stumbled, her foot catching on a submerged root. She went down hard, face first into the black water. "Get up!" I screamed, stopping and turning back. The creature was 50 yards back, a blur of dark fur and muscle, tearing through a curtain of Spanish moss. It saw Judith fall. It let out a huffing, eager sound and accelerated, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Judith rolled over, spitting water, her eyes wide and hopeless. "Jude, I can't! My ankle!" "I don't care!" I hauled her up by the back of her vest, lifting her until her feet found traction. "You run on it or you die on it! Move!" I shoved her forward with every ounce of strength I had left. She cried out in pain, but started hobbling, then running, fear acting as the ultimate anesthetic. We crashed through a shallow creek bed, the water churning around our thighs. I risked a glance back. The Alpha hit the creek bank without slowing, launching itself into the air. It cleared the water in a single impossible leap, landing on the other side with a wet slap that sounded like a gunshot. It was playing with us. It could have caught us by now. It was enjoying the chase, the panic, the smell of our terror. "The ATV!" I shouted, spotting the glint of the red fender through the trees ahead. "Judith, the truck is too far. Get to the ATV." We had parked the four-wheeler near the levee base as a backup, a mile closer than the truck. It was our only chance. Judith saw it and surged forward, leaving me a step behind. We were lungs and legs, nothing else. My chest felt like it was filled with broken glass. My legs were heavy lead weights. But the sound of heavy breathing, wet and rattling and impossibly close, kept me moving. The creature let out a snarl right behind my ear. I didn't look. I ducked instinctively, throwing myself to the left around a massive cypress trunk. A clawed hand the size of a shovel slammed into the tree right where my head had been a second before, tearing a chunk of bark off with a sound like ripping canvas. The creature skidded in the mud, its momentum carrying me past me for a fraction of a second. "Start it!" I screamed at Judith, who was clawing her way up the muddy embankment toward the machine. She threw herself onto the seat, fumbling with the key. I scrambled up the bank on all fours, clawing into the dirt, listening to the squelch of the monster recovering its footing behind me. The engine sputtered. Judith screamed, slamming her thumb against the starter again. Whir, whir. "Come on," I begged, lunging for the back rack of the ATV just as the engine roared to life. I swung my leg over the back, grabbing Judith around the waist. "Go, go, go!" She slammed the gear shifter forward and gunned the throttle. The tires spun in the slick mud, slinging black sludge into the air, finding no traction. A shadow fell over us. I looked back to see the Alpha standing at the bottom of the embankment, rising up to its full height, its chest heaving, its eyes burning with hateful intelligence. It coiled its legs, preparing to spring up the hill and drag us back down into the dark. Then the tires caught. The ATV bucked forward, throwing us back against the seat, and we shot up the levee wall just as the Alpha's claws raked through the air, inches from the rear tires.
The ATV engine screamed, a high-pitched mechanical whine that tore through the heavy swamp air as we hit the flat top of the levee. Judith didn't let off the throttle. She had the handlebars in a death grip, her knuckles white, her body hunched forward as if she could physically pull the machine faster by sheer will. We were doing 40 miles an hour over rutted gravel, the suspension bottoming out with bone-jarring slams that threatened to throw us into the canal with every bounce. I twisted around in the seat, gripping the rear rack with one hand and clutching my useless rifle with the other. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like a second engine. "Don't look back!
Judith screamed, her voice shredded by the wind and tears. But I did look back. I had to. The creature wasn't gone. It had crested the levee bank behind us, black water shedding from its fur in a dirty spray. It hit the gravel running, not the awkward bounding gait of a bear, but the fluid, terrifying lope of a wolf. But it was huge. At full extension, it looked like a dark locomotive barreling down the track, and it was gaining. "Faster!" I roared, slapping Judith's shoulder. "It's closing!" "I can't!" she shrieked back. "It's maxed out!" The gravel road stretched out ahead of us, a straight shot to where we'd parked the Silverado a mile away. That truck was our only salvation. The ATV left us exposed, soft meat on a metal frame. The Silverado was steel and glass. The Alpha dropped its head low, its ears flattened against its skull, cutting through the wind resistance. It was an apex predator engaging in a persistence hunt, and it knew exactly how fast we could go. It was pacing us, waiting for a mistake, a thrown belt, a blown tire, a slide into the ditch. I watched, mesmerized with horror, as the gap shrank. 50 yards, 40, 30. I could see the yellow of its eyes locked onto us, burning with a calm, hateful intelligence. It wasn't panting, it wasn't tiring, it was inevitable. "The truck!" Judith yelled. I spun around. The silver grille of Dad's pickup glinted in the sun ahead. It looked like a fortress. "Don't slow down until you hit the bumper," I commanded. "We bail and we dive. You hear me? Do not stop." Judith didn't answer. She kept the throttle pinned until the last possible second, then slammed the brakes. The ATV skidded sideways, tires tearing up the gravel, coming to a violent halt 10 feet from the driver's side door. "Go!" We scrambled off the machine. I hit the ground running, digging into my pocket for the keys. My hands were slick with sweat and mud. The keys felt like live fish, slippery and impossible to grip. I heard the heavy thump, thump, thump of the creature's paws hitting the gravel. It was close enough now that I could hear the wet rattle of its breath. "Jude, the door!" Judith screamed, yanking on the handle. It was locked. I fumbled with the fob, my thumb slipping on the button. I pressed it. Click, clack. The locks disengaged. Judith threw the door open and scrambled across the bench seat to the passenger side. I dove in after her, not bothering to check my footing, just hurling my body into the cab. A shadow engulfed the open doorway. The smell hit me first, that overwhelming stench of musk and ozone. I looked up just as I grabbed the interior handle. The Alpha was there. It wasn't running anymore. It had stopped right beside the truck, towering over the cab. It stood on its hind legs, its chest heaving, looking down at me through the open door. For a split second, we were face to face. I saw the pores in its dark nose, the thick, ropey saliva dripping from its black lips, the ancient, milky scar on its left eye. It didn't roar. It just reached out. I slammed the door. The heavy steel latched with a solid thud, a fraction of a second before the creature made contact. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life. I didn't check the mirrors. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The tires spun on the loose gravel, the truck fishtailing violently. At that exact moment, the truck rocked as if we had been T-boned by another vehicle. Screech! The sound was agonizing, metal shearing against metal, loud enough to set my teeth on edge. The entire chassis shuddered under the impact. The creature had taken a swing. "Drive, Jude, drive!" Judith was curled into a ball in the passenger footwell, her hands over her ears. I fought the steering wheel, correcting the slide, and the tires finally bit into the road. We shot forward, dust billowing out behind us in a massive cloud. I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing in the middle of the gravel road, shrinking in the distance. It stood on 2 legs, watching us go. It didn't chase. It didn't have to. It had made its point. We didn't speak for 5 miles. I drove at 80, my knuckles white, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, waiting for the nightmare to reappear. But the road behind us remained empty. When my heart rate finally dropped below dangerous levels, I slowed down enough to hear the truck itself. There was a new noise, a whistling of wind coming from the rear driver's side. I pulled over on the main highway, miles away from the tree line where the sun was bright and cars were passing by like nothing had happened. I stepped out, my legs shaking so bad I almost fell, and walked to the back of the truck. I stared at the bed of the pickup. 3 parallel gouges ran from the wheel well to the tailgate. They were deep, deep enough to curl the steel back like stripped bark, exposing the raw silver metal underneath the paint. They were perfectly spaced, wider than a man's hand. I traced the edge of the torn metal with a trembling finger. No bear could do this. No machinery we owned could do this. Judith didn't get out. She just sat in the cab, staring forward, shivering in the air conditioning. We had escaped the Alpha, but looking at the ruin of the truck's steel, I knew the hardest part was still ahead of us. We had to go home, and we had to explain this to Dad.
The drive back to the house was a blur of asphalt and heat waves, the silence in the cab heavier than the swamp air had been. When I finally turned into the gravel driveway, the familiar crunch of the tires felt alien, as if we were returning from a different planet. The house looked exactly the same, white siding, green shutters, Dad's rocking chair on the porch, but it felt like a stage set I no longer knew the lines for. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling manifold and the ragged sound of Judith's breathing. She hadn't said a word since the highway. She just stared at her hands, which were still trembling in her lap, caked with dried black mud. The screen door slammed. Dad walked down the steps, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked annoyed, checking his watch. We were back early. In his mind, that meant failure. He didn't see the mud, the torn clothes, or the shell-shocked look in Judith's eyes. He just saw a wasted afternoon. "Back already?" he called out, tossing the rag onto the railing. "I assume that means you missed, or did you get too hot and give up?" I opened the door and stepped out. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced them to hold me up. I didn't answer him. I just walked to the back of the truck and pointed. Dad frowned, sensing the shift in my demeanor. He walked past me, his boots crunching on the gravel, and rounded the corner of the bed. He stopped dead. The 3 parallel gouges ran nearly the full length of the quarter panel, deep, jagged trenches that had curled the steel back like peel from an orange. The raw metal shined brightly in the afternoon sun, a violent contrast to the dark paint. "What in the hell did you do?" Dad's voice dropped an octave, losing its annoyance and finding its anger. He reached out, touching the ruined steel. "You wrecked the truck. I gave you the keys for 5 hours, and you wrecked the truck." "It wasn't me," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "Look at it, Dad. Look at the marks." "I am looking at them," he snapped, turning on me. "You backed into something. A gatepost? Some old machinery in the weeds? You were driving too fast, weren't you?" "It was a monster," Judith whispered from the cab. Dad froze, then looked at her through the open window. She hadn't moved. She looked small, broken. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice softening just a fraction for her. It was huge," she stammered, tears spilling over again. "It chased us. It almost got us." Dad looked from her to me, his jaw tightening. He didn't see fear. He saw hysteria. And in his world, hysteria had a cause. He turned back to the truck, running his thumb over the jagged metal again. He was looking right at evidence that defied physics, steel torn like paper, and his brain was frantically rewriting reality to fit his small, square box of a world. "A bear," he muttered, nodding to himself. "You spooked a black bear. It swiped the truck while you were panicking." "A bear?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that felt like it scraped my throat. "Dad, look at the spacing. Those claws are 6 inches apart. A bear has 5 claws. That thing has hands. It stood 8 feet tall. It ran 40 miles an hour." "Stop it,"
Dad warned, pointing a finger at my chest. "Stop talking nonsense. There are no 8-foot wolves in Mississippi. You ran into a bear, you panicked, and you scraped the truck against a tree or a fence post trying to get away. That's what happened." "It stood on 2 legs," I shouted, my control finally snapping. "It looked right at us. It tore the blind apart." "I said enough," Dad roared, stepping into my space, his chest heaving. "I don't want to hear these ghost stories. You're 19 years old, Jude. Act like it." He gestured violently toward Judith, who was now sobbing into her hands. "Look at your sister. She's terrified. And instead of calming her down, instead of handling the situation like a man, you're feeding her this garbage about monsters to cover up your own reckless driving." I stared at him. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life trying to earn by being the responsible one, the quiet one, the mule. And I realized, with a clarity that cut deeper than the alpha's claws ever could, that he would never believe me. He couldn't. If he believed me, he'd have to admit he sent his children into a death trap. It was easier to believe I was a liar than to believe he was wrong. "I saved her life," I said quietly. "I dragged her out of that swamp while that thing was hunting us. I saved her." Dad scoffed, turning away to open the passenger door and help Judith down. "You scared her half to death is what you did. Come on, honey, let's get you inside. We'll get you cleaned up. Jude can deal with the truck." He put his arm around her, shielding her, whispering comforts that he never offered me. Judith didn't look back. She leaned into him, letting him take the burden, letting him rewrite the story into something safe. She let me take the fall, again. I stood in the driveway alone, the heat of the engine radiating against my legs, watching them walk into the house. The screen door slammed shut, sealing them inside their safe, rational world. I looked down at the gouges in the steel one last time. They were real. I ran my finger along the sharp edge until it cut my skin, just to feel the sting, just to prove I wasn't crazy. That night, the house was silent. I didn't go to dinner. I stayed in my room, the door locked, staring at the ceiling fan in the dark. I knew I couldn't stay here. The woods I loved were poisoned now, and the house was a prison of denial. I rolled over and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen was harsh in the darkness. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keys. There was only one person I could think of, a name I'd seen in the papers, a deputy in the next county over who handled the weird calls, the ones the sheriff laughed off, a man who had a reputation for listening when everyone else stopped. I opened a new email and typed the address. To Deputy Raymond A. Jackson. Subject: What really happens in the Delta? Deputy Jackson, my name is Jude. I live in the bottoms south of the river. Everyone tells me I saw a bear today. My father says I hit a tree, but I know what bears look like, and I know what trees look like. I'm writing to you because I need to tell someone the truth before I leave this place. We have an alpha out here, and it's not afraid of guns. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just asking you to believe me. I hit send. Then I closed the laptop, packed my bag, and waited for the sun to rise so I could get the hell out of Mississippi.